Hey guys, welcome again to another online experience here at Pinnacle Church. You may be watching me, you may be listening on podcasts, you may be even listening on the radio, and I just want to say we're glad you're taking time out of your day to connect with us this way. We're still in this series we started called Parenting Today, where we're learning about how to parent today. And I like to say this at the beginning, you may be a grandparent, you may be the parent of an adult kid, you may not have kids, but here's the thing. Every week there's been something that no matter where you're at on your parenting journey, or even if you're not quite there yet, or you may never be there, there's been things that we've said that can help you in your life. So I want you to stay connected if you find yourself there. And of course, if you're a parent, you definitely need to stay connected. And what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about what we call the stages or seasons of parenting, because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that as your children grow, they go through different developmental stages, and you have to parent according to those seasons and stages. And Sandra Stanley, in their book Parenthood, they have a great statement there. They say kids inherently know when it's time to move on, but the issue with parents is a lot of times we're the last to know when to move on. And we can have the bad habit of either parenting way too far ahead of a season or trying to stay stuck in a season. And it's just not always obvious for us when we need to change. And the issue is if we don't recognize when it's time to change, we don't just make parenting harder for ourselves. We can make it harder for our kids too. And so I want to go through and look at these stages, talk about how we need to shift in those changes and what we need to do. And to do that, of course, first, I just want to talk about this idea of seasons to begin with. So if you're going to look in your phone, online, it'll be on the screen. We're going to go to the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes is, by tradition, we believe that King Solomon wrote this book, and it's what we call wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is basically principles for doing life. It's wise. And in Ecclesiastes, there's a verse I'm about to read you that is one of the most familiar verses in the world, thanks to a 1960s folk song hit by a band called the Byrds, Time, that you're going to recognize. But I still think it's good for us to look at it. So Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1, listen to what Solomon says. He says, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heaven. So you look at that, self-explanatory. He goes after this verse. He makes this big long list. There's a time to kill. There's a time for peace. There's a time for war. There's a time to plant. There's a time to sow. He goes through all these activities of life, right? Time to be born, a time to die, all that. But the whole point here is that life is lived in a rhythm, I believe. And he's saying that in your life, there are these things we call seasons. I want you to hone in on that word season. He says there's a time for everything and a season, and notice this, for every activity under the heavens. So that means that there are seasons to our parenting. And just like nature has seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall, the seasons you find yourself in life or in your parenting are time specific, and certain things you would do in one season of the year, you don't necessarily do in the other seasons of the year. Now, as a side note, sometimes people will look at me and go, man, I'm just in a season, and I'll be sitting there going, dude, you've been doing what you've been doing for like 20 years. I don't know if I'd call it a season, more so it's your life, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about the periods of time in our life that over time we change and things have to change with us. And our parenting is that way. We're going to see in a minute that there's 4 stages, seasons, if you will, of parenting. And what you do in each of those seasons has to change. It has to shift. Matter of fact, here's an idea I want you to get. It's this: great parenting, really great parenting, is knowing the season you're in and when it is time to shift, when it is time to change. And that's hard for some of us because we either have a difficulty changing and moving on, or sometimes we can actually move too fast and get way ahead of where we need to be. And the whole point is, it's sort of like when I say you need to, one, recognize the season you're in, understand how you need to parent in that season, but two, knowing when it's time to shift. I kind of think of it as an old stick shift. When I was learning to drive growing up, I learned on a stick shift. Now, a lot of people today don't, because we have so many cars that are automatics. But if you've ever driven a stick shift, you know timing's important. If you don't change the gears properly and in sometimes the right sequence and way, you're going to grind the gears. And if you don't move and have the timing properly as a parent of knowing when to move from stage to stage, you're basically grinding the gears of not only your life, but also your kids. And so I want to look at these 4 stages of parenting and see how they work. These 4 seasons, knowing, okay, that if we're going to be great parents, it's important for us to be intentional, mindful, and recognize the season we're in, and then knowing when it's time to make that shift. So let's just go through these 4 real quickly, okay? The first one's this. It's what we call the discipline years. And that's 0 to 5 years old. That's from the time they're born till the time they're about 5, about to hit kindergarten. And the words we like to use with these are consistency and consequences. These are the years when we have to be consistent in how we discipline our kids. And we talked about discipline last week, but there has to be a consistency, and we teach our kids that there's consequences. In these years, you don't really explain why you're doing something, because a small child, a baby, a toddler, as they get up, and toddlers, they need to learn to be obedient. They need to know that when mom or dad say something, they need to listen, because there's consequences. In a way, you've got to be like gravity in the kid's life. You know, I don't have to explain to you gravity when you fall. You know it exists. And they learn that there's consequences to their actions. You're trying to teach them for multiple reasons, for safety and all sorts of things. You're just showing them what's right, what's wrong. And of course, hey, listen to dad. Don't put your hand on that hot stove. You'll get burned. And it's so funny to me, because now I'm a grandparent. And I guess as I was thinking about these, there's 4 stages, but I think you could argue there's a 5th that some of us get to enter into, is the grandparent stage, right? And as a grandparent, you're kind of coming alongside the parents and helping them to walk their kids through these stages. And I hear grandparents all the time say to me, oh, all I do is I just spoil them and send them back. But the problem with that is I want to be a support to them. And so I'm thinking about this. I'm the grandparent of a toddler right now. Well, she's about to be. She's going to be 2 soon. And my wife, and her grandparent name is Birdie, she doesn't know how to tell the grandbaby no. She's just like, okay, you can do that. And I'm over here like, no, you need to back mom and dad up. You need to tell her no. And I'm like, she's about to do something and get hurt. Well, I'll just get her. I'm like, no, you need to teach her to not do it herself. And so it's just funny to me. The big thing about these years is you are starting to lay a foundation for the rest of their life. And so you want to teach them in these years, it's all about obedience and being consistent in how you do it and the consequences of what happened. They have to understand that. Now, they're going to move past that. And from 5 to 12-year-olds is what we call the training years. These are the years where you really start to help them understand the why beyond the what. Now, sometimes I know some of us, our parenting style might be, you just do as I tell you to, right? But really, as kids getting to this stage of their life, we've got to move past, you just do what I tell you to helping them understand the reasoning behind the decisions we make, the reasoning behind why there's certain behaviors we expect from them. This is your moment where you are instilling the values you want to instill in your children, and you want them to start to understand. And that's why we say train while you explain. And there is an important thing about that training. What is training? Training happens through repetition, training happens through modeling, and training happens through practice. And so I want you to think about this. I'll be honest, I didn't always do well at the practice part. I was talking to my daughter and I said, hey, how did I do on this? And she said, you're pretty good to explain the why behind stuff. Now, there were times when you didn't always get it right. You enormously fail and like, just do what I say. But the practicing part, I wasn't very good at, because I've read some things parents say, hey, if there's something you want your kid to know how to do, you've got to practice it with them. You want your kid to know how to sit there and to probably shake hands with somebody? You need to practice it with them. You want your kid to know how to speak to someone in a proper manner? You need to practice it with them. You want your kid to not come up and rudely interrupt you every time you're having a conversation with an adult? Practice teaching them how to not do that. I think that sometimes we just expect kids to be like plants, and by osmosis, by the fact that they're in our family, they get what we want. And I'll tell you, I could be really bad about that. Because my daughter, we were talking, because, when you do a parenting series, you start to have lots of conversations with your adult daughter, because you get a little mindful of what did I do right and what did I really screw up and send you the counselor for. And so we were having a conversation about some of this stuff, and I said, Erica, did you feel like we put a lot of expectations on you? She said, well, you didn't, but you did, and they were usually the unspoken expectations. And that hit me. I'm like, yeah. Okay, there were times when there were things we expected, but we never really said it to you. We just expected it. And how fair is that to anyone, to a child especially? So that's the training years. Now, then you move past that to what we call the coaching years. That's 12 to about 18 years old. And that's where you connect more than you correct. And I will tell you this. This is one of the hardest stages. This is the teenage stage. And this is where parents, I see in my own experience, looking at many people I know and myself, have the hardest time making the shift in this stage. Because this is where your kids are getting more independent. This is where you need to connect way more with them than correct. And you're saying, wait a minute, are you telling me not to correct my kids? I'm not saying that, but I am saying this is the stage where you have to fight for the relationship. This is the stage where you want them coming to you and telling you what's going on in their life. This is the stage where you've got to be more of a coach than a referee. Think about it. All a referee does is blows the whistle and points out mistakes and fouls. They don't build up. A coach, on the other hand, is encouraging and building up. Coaches don't play on the field. They let their players play. But when needed, they make substitutions. When needed, they'll step in. When needed, they'll bring some discipline. But by and large, they're not playing the game. And this is the first reality of when your teenagers, your middle schoolers, your teenagers, are starting to really play the game independent of you in their life. And it's so important that we give them that freedom, but we're also there when they need us within the boundaries to step in. But you also want to stay connected, because this is such a critical time in a person's life. I just read an article the other day in the Journal of the American Medical Association that said they found that adolescents, teenagers, with strong parent relationships, they remained very connected to their parents in a healthy relational way, that later in their life, they had lower rates of substance abuse, they had better mental well-being, and they even had reduced cardiovascular risk later in their life. So there's something to be said there about this idea of connecting, because here's why. And this is one thing my daughter said, you did get this right. She said, I always knew I could come talk to you no matter what. I knew that no matter how bad, if I did something screwed up, I could come talk to you. You were not going to flip out. You were going to remain calm. You were going to listen to me. There might be some consequences. There might not be, but you were going to be there. You were going to be there to listen to me. And that is so important, because you want your kid coming to you. Yes, we're going to talk later on when we talk about sharing our faith. At this stage of your kid's life, there are going to need to be other relationships. There are going to need to be people that they go to other than you. But I always wanted me to be the first call. I always wanted my child to know that we were a safe haven, no matter what. Even if there were things going on, things she believed, things she was doing that we were like, no. We still wanted her to know that we were a safe place. And so there was that connection more than correction. And I talked about this last week. I'm going to say it again because I think I just need to drum this into parents of teenagers. Your response is so hugely important, man. When your teenager sits down and tells you something and you're inside going nutso, you can never let them see on the outside what's going on in here. You've got to remain calm. You've got to listen, because when you do that, you're building relational capital to give you influence in their life. And so it's just so hugely important. And then, of course, the fourth stage, and it's an open-ended stage because it lasts the rest of their life, is the friendship years. This is when your child becomes an adult. And hopefully all the hard work, all the sweat and tears, the late nights, the worrying, the praying, the trying to get it right, getting it wrong, then having some steps forward, steps back, so all that, because no one is a perfect parent, all that comes together, and then you get to enjoy your children, your adult children, now as friends. You have a different relationship with your adult children. And what you do then is you influence through relationship. It's funny, I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine, and we were talking about because one of our small groups is doing the parenthood study that some of this material is based on, and he said, that first week was really challenging for me because what I was hearing from the guy who wrote the book, from Andy and Sandra, was really the goal of parenting is just for your kids to like you. And he said, I have a hard time with that. And I said, I understand that. I said, but he'll get to more eventually. But I said, but you need to realize something. If relationship equals influence, then the best thing you can have when your child is finally an adult is that they do like you, that you do have a friendship with them, because that's the only way you're going to have influence. Because even though they're an adult, they don't cease being your kid, man. You still worry about them. You still care for them. You still pray for them. But you have to understand at that moment now, you don't have authority. You can't go and, constantly give them advice. You only get to do that when they come to you for it. I mean, no one wants every time they call up their parent to be criticized. They want to be supported. A good way of saying how to parent your adult children, I like to say this, is keep the door open and your mouth shut. There's a book by that title, by the way. The idea there is, the door's always open. You always got a home with us. We're always here for you. And I'll keep my mouth shut until you want me to say something. It's like a friendship. You influence through friendship. And so, okay, that's the 4 stages. And the issue is, as I said, is great parenting is recognizing that season, but also knowing when it's time to shift. And a lot of times I see some of the biggest problems come from going from the training years to the coaching years, and even when the coaching years into the adult years, when parents can't make that shift to let go or to move forward. And so how do we do this, right? Well, there's a proverb, Proverbs 14:8. And it says this, and I think it really relates. It says, the prudent understand where they're going, but fools deceive themselves. Right here is basically a comparison between 2 types of people, a prudent person and a foolish person. A prudent person is someone who's well thought out. And here he's saying someone who's thoughtful, who's intentional, well thought out. He says they understand where they're going. What he's saying is they know the direction they're headed in their life. The foolish, he says, they deceive themselves, meaning they deceive themselves that things don't change. Put that into your parenting. A prudent parent understands that there's seasons. A prudent parent understands that things change. A wise, prudent parent understands they have to change as their child changes, and that what they did when they were 5, they cannot do when they're 17. And they know that, and they're willing to change. And I want to add this. A wise parent, a prudent person, understands too that they themselves can change. One of the worst things we can do, guys, is to say, well, that's just how I am. Daddy parented me that way, and that's how we'll do it, by God. No. That's horrible, first off. And you are never, ever going to break. Because I'm going to be honest, especially if you come from our culture, there are things that need to be broken from your past, okay? Not saying your mom and daddy were bad, not saying none of that. But every generation, there are some things in the generation before. My daughter had to do it for me. There are certain things that need to change for the betterment of your family and your children. And when you and I are not willing to change, not willing to listen, we are doing a real disservice to our families and especially to our kids, even our adult kids. And we're really, according to this, we're foolish. We're just foolish. Because a foolish person will deceive themselves. They'll say nothing changes. This is how it's got to be. What worked then will work now. And let me say this as a side note. That's kind of a good principle for life to understand. I need to understand when it's time to change. But anyways, so how do we do this, right? How do we do it? Well, there's two things I want to leave you with. And it's this. One, you got to parent for the season you're in, not the one you miss or you wish for. This is so vitally important. You've got to parent for where you find yourself today. I think a lot of times parents, because when you started as a young parent, you don't realize how quick these stages sometimes can go. I remember the day when I was riding in a car with my daughter when she was a teenager. She was driving the car, and I looked over at her, and I had this moment of, where did this little woman come from? And it seemed like the 17 years before were just gone. And so sometimes we don't recognize how fast it moves. And I always say, man, one, that's why you parent for the season you're at, is enjoy where you're at, because it's not going to last and you're going to have to shift and change. You're still going to enjoy your kids all the way through, but you are going to have to make changes. You are going to have to shift. And the idea there is, listen, you don't rush ahead to the future. Some people try to treat their kid like they're 15 when they're 10. You don't do that either. And some long for when the kid was little. But you've got to lean in, accept where you're at, and be fully present in the season you're in. Not the one you miss, not the one you wish for. And as a parent of an adult child now, let me say this. This is a very important principle, because I think as you get older, as your children get older, you can look back on your life and you'll celebrate some of the wins, but inevitably you will have regrets. And if you're going to parent in the season you're in, as the parent of an adult child, you can't live out of those regrets. You can see them, you can say, okay, I recognize that. There's a lesson learned from that, but that's the past. I can't change that. I can't change what I did wrong, but I can celebrate what I did right. But now I've got to simply move into the season I find myself in and try to be the best, greatest parent I can in this season, parenting in the stage I'm in the manner that's appropriate for the stage I'm in. And so that's so important, guys. We've got to parent for the season you're in, not the one you miss or you wish for. And here's the second one. It goes with the first one. When the time comes, be ready to let go and move forward. This can be really hard for some people. You've got to be ready to move from stage to stage. If you're not, you're going to have some very frustrated kids and a very strained relationship. You've got to be ready when the time comes to say, okay, this is where we're moving now. I got to move forward. I did what I could when they were this age. I did what I could here, but now I've got to move forward. When they move into their teenage years, I've got to start loosening the reins. I've got to start being more of a coach than a referee in their life. When they're small and they move up into the training years, I've got to understand, I've got to start asking those why questions. And you know, some kids, they ask a lot of why questions, but I've got to start helping them to understand the why behind the what. And when they become an adult, man, even though it's hard, even though you may see them about to run into a train, you got to allow them to run into that train, because now you've got to be more of a person of influence And sometimes in their adult life, they're going to have to make some mistakes to grow into the person they're meant to be as they grow as an adult. And that's hard. That's hard. I want to say this as a side note, okay, as we're talking about these stages. One thing that I see that parents, that we can do to the detriment of our children throughout their development and even into their adulthood, is we bail them out far too much. Listen, you need to allow your kids to fail. My wife was working at a local middle school for a season, and she said, it amazes me, these kids, they'll forget things and do this. And she says, back then we didn't have cell phones and all that. And if you forgot your band instrument, well, you forgot your band instrument and you learned a lesson not to forget your band instrument. She said, but there's these parents, man, they will just constantly all day long, they're bringing stuff, they're bailing their kids out. And I want to tell you, listen to me, okay? Stop bailing them out. You're not doing them any good. You've got to help them move forward. You've got to help them understand and grow. And I think they're not bailing out. This is just a side note. They're not bailing out, I think, has to begin when they're in elementary school. You start allowing them to fail. It's not the end of the world if they fail. And by the way, mom and dad, it's not a reflection on you or your parenting or your reputation if your kid fails. Just had to say that. So, great parenting understands their seasons. And great parents know when to shift from season to season. And can you imagine with me, right? If we could all fully embrace this, if parents could walk through these seasons and change when they needed to, and parent in the way we need to, I think we would have a generation of kids that would grow up way more healthier, way more confident, way more connected with their parents as they move into adulthood. And then you would have far more influence going on through relationships with their children. And you and there will be parents experiencing the joy of what finally comes when all the sweat equity has been paid, of having a close, meaningful relationship with your adult children who hopefully love Jesus, love people, and they love being around you. So let's be great parents. Let's understand where we're at. And let's change when we need to change and shift when we need to shift. Let me pray for us, guys. Father, as we think about this, God, and we think about that verse in Ecclesiastes, and it's so clear life is made up of seasons. And just as the seasons change and the weather changes and things are done differently in those seasons, God, may we as parents recognize that. Where we struggle, God, to let go, give us the grace to let go. Where we struggle, God, and long for another time, or we look forward during difficult times for a better time, let us be fully present in the moment God has us now. Knowing, God, that you've given our children to us as a gift. Help us, God, to pour into the next generation. And even those of us, God, who've hung in here and listened to this, that they'll understand that even if they that don't have kids, that, God, they have a part to play in this as well. Whether grandparents, uncles, friends, whatever. And God, may we understand you're the great parent, and you parent us through our own seasons as we are your children. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys, thank you for connecting again with us this way, and we'll do this again next week. I'll see you later. Bye.